The storm had swallowed the horizon long before the soldiers realized how lost they were. Snow drifted through the air in violent spirals, twisting into shapes that vanished as quickly as they formed. The temperature had dropped so sharply that even their breath froze the moment it escaped their mouths. Visibility was barely an arm's length, and the wind roared with such force that it drowned out their own thoughts. It was the kind of Canadian blizzard that didn't just threaten to kill, it threatened to erase. And yet, somewhere in the middle of this white oblivion, a Cree scout knelt in the snow, completely calm, touching the frozen ground with the tips of his fingers as though reading a page no one else could see. What happened next would echo for years inside military outposts and whispered stories. A Cree scout tracking an entire enemy battalion through a blizzard where even sound and direction collapsed. But before the officers would express their disbelief, before they would utter the sentence that became legend, something far more important happened in the frozen silence of that afternoon. The scout lifted his head slowly, his dark hair whipping violently in the wind, his eyes narrowing as he scanned a world the soldiers behind him could not even begin to decipher. One of the officers shouted through the storm, demanding to know whether the enemy had changed direction. The scout didn't answer immediately. His hand moved across the snow with practiced precision, feeling the density of each layer, testing the texture of ice hidden beneath the surface, sensing vibrations that had no logical reason to exist. To the soldiers, it looked like superstition. To him, it was science, Cree science, the kind passed down through generations, long before the Canadian wilderness was marked on any map. Finally, he stood and pointed toward what looked like a wall of endless white. The lieutenant squinted, seeing nothing. The scout's voice cut through the wind with calm certainty. They turned east. The lieutenant blinked in disbelief. East, in this, he shouted, gesturing at the storm. No one can see a thing out here. But the scout wasn't guessing. He had felt the subtle shift in snow pressure, a pattern of compacted layers crushed under dozens of synchronized boots. He had noticed the way the wind had carried faint traces of disturbed frost, microscopic fragments that drifted differently when broken by movement. He had felt the land respond. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, but they had learned one lesson earlier in the campaign. When a Cree scout spoke, you listened. The men followed him reluctantly, pushing through the blizzard in a single file line behind the scout's steady pace. The further they walked, the more oppressive the storm became. The sky darkened, though it was barely late afternoon, and gusts of wind slammed into their bodies with enough force to knock the younger soldiers off balance. The scout, however, walked as if the storm parted for him. His steps were measured, deliberate, guided not by sight but by an intimate understanding of how the land spoke through snow. He paused again several minutes later, this time kneeling without being prompted. The lieutenant leaned forward. "What now?" he asked, trying to read anything in the scout's posture. The scout pressed his palm against the ground, then closed his eyes. The silence beneath the storm was like a living thing, layered and complex. He could feel, faintly but distinctly, the rhythmic pulse of dozens of feet compacting the snow not long ago. The soldiers saw only blank whiteness. The scout saw movement frozen in time. His eyes snapped open. The men trudged behind him, unsure whether they were following a miracle or madness. The scout lifted his hand, signaling for silence. A moment later he tilted his head, listening to something the others couldn't possibly hear. A wave of exhilaration passed through the unit, quickly followed by confusion. How could he track footsteps in a storm that erased sound? How could he feel vibrations through a snowfield drowning under wind? The officers were about to ask when the scout knelt again and placed his ear to the snow. He stayed like that for several long seconds, then stood slowly. His next words stunned everyone. "They're dividing," he said, half turning north, half continuing east. The lieutenant inhaled sharply. "You're sure?" The scout nodded once. "They're trying to confuse us." The officers exchanged worried glances. If the enemy split, it would take hours to regroup or intercept them. The storm made communication nearly impossible. But the scout continued speaking. "The ones heading north are carrying something heavy. Equipment, maybe weapons. The ones heading east are faster. Probably scouts." The lieutenant stared at him in disbelief. "You can hear that?" The scout turned his gaze to the horizon. "I can feel it." He crouched low, narrowing his eyes. The lieutenant approached him cautiously. "What is it?" The scout didn't respond immediately. He brushed away a thin layer of loose powder until he revealed a shape in the snow barely visible, already fading. A footprint, but not just any footprint, a heated one. The lieutenant's eyes widened. "They can't be far," he muttered. The scout nodded. "Minutes," he said. The men tightened their formation, gripping their rifles even though most of them couldn't see 5 feet in front of their faces. The storm shrieked like a living creature. But beneath the roar, the scout heard it again, a pattern of movement, a stuttered rhythm, a shift in weight. The enemy had stopped, maybe to rest, maybe to reassess, but they had stopped. And they were dangerously close. The lieutenant leaned toward the scout and whispered, "If you can sense them this clearly, can they sense us?" The scout shook his head. "Not in this storm," he said. "But they're listening. They're afraid of what they can't see." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The idea that both sides were trapped inside the same white labyrinth, listening for each other like ghosts on a frozen battlefield, made the moment feel surreal. The scout suddenly straightened, his expression sharpening. "They're moving again," he said. "Faster. They know we're near." The lieutenant cursed under his breath and signaled for the men to advance. But before they could take more than a few steps, a sound broke through the storm, soft, muffled but unmistakable. A single shot fired somewhere ahead, then another, not aimed at the Canadians. A struggle, a warning. The scout's eyes widened. "They're fighting something," he murmured. The soldiers froze. Fighting what out here? In a storm where no human should even be standing. The scout didn't wait for orders. He began moving faster, weaving through the storm with renewed urgency. The officers followed him despite their confusion. The blizzard thickened again, nearly swallowing the world whole. Every direction looked the same, every sound distorted, but the scout pushed forward until, suddenly, he stopped. The men behind him held their breath as he raised one hand, signaling them to crouch low. He pointed into the swirling white ahead of them. "There," he whispered, "they're right there." But when the officers squinted into the blizzard, they saw nothing, not even shadows. And that was the moment the lieutenant realized something terrifying. The Cree scout wasn't seeing the enemy. He was sensing them. But what he revealed next, what he said the enemy was doing, and why, would become the moment Canadian officers would talk about for decades. The moment they would describe with disbelief in every retelling, and that moment was only seconds away. The blizzard churned so violently that the world felt as if it was spinning inside a giant, frozen vortex. Snow whipped across the soldiers' faces with such force that their skin burned beneath layers of frost. They crouched low, following the scout's signal, but uncertainty rippled through the group like a second wind. They saw nothing, no figures, no outlines, not even a shadow to suggest that anyone stood ahead of them in this white chaos. And yet the Cree scout remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on something invisible, his breath steady despite the storm's ferocity. The lieutenant crawled closer to him, shouting over the storm, asking what exactly he was sensing. The scout did not answer immediately. He leaned forward slightly, listening not to the wind but to the silence hidden beneath it, a silence broken only by faint, fractured sounds carried from a distance. Sounds the soldiers behind him could not interpret. Sounds that didn't belong in a blizzard at all. A moment later the scout spoke. "They're circling." The lieutenant blinked. "Circling who?" The scout's jaw tightened. "Each other." Confusion rippled through the men. Why would an enemy battalion turn on itself? Why would they fight one another in the middle of a storm strong enough to kill them all? The scout pressed his fingers into the snow again, feeling vibrations no one else could detect. His voice grew lower. "They're arguing, loud enough for the land to hear it. Someone's wounded. Someone else wants to leave him behind." The soldiers stared, baffled by the detail. How could he know this? But the scout kept talking, his tone steady, as if translating a language woven into the ground. "They don't know where they are anymore. They think they were followed by more than one unit." The lieutenant's eyebrows lifted. "More than one. But we're alone." The scout tilted his head. "They don't know that." The soldiers exchanged looks. Fear could create illusions. Tension could tear discipline apart. And a blizzard like this could turn even trained men into frightened silhouettes, stumbling through the unknown. The scout stood suddenly. "We need to move," he said. "It's changing again." They followed him, crawling through the storm until the wind softened just enough for their breaths to become audible again. The shift was subtle, almost undetectable to anyone else, but the scout reacted instantly. He pushed forward, tracing the path of footprints buried beneath fresh snow. Some were deep, others shallow, some hurried, others staggered. The scout read them as if they were sentences. The lieutenant asked what he saw. The scout pointed to a series of uneven impressions. "Fear," he said simply. The soldiers didn't know how to respond. Footprints did not show fear, not to them, at least, but the scout pointed to slight inconsistencies, uneven pressure, fading edges. "They were running," he added, "but not from us." The storm shrieked again, drowning out any possibility of further questioning. The group marched in silence, relying entirely on the scout's instincts as they waded through thigh-deep snow. Their bodies ached, their minds drifted dangerously toward the edge of exhaustion. But the scout moved as though guided by a force beyond sight. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. The lieutenant finally shouted for the scout to stop and explain what he sensed. The scout halted, breathing deeply. "They're close," he said. Very close, but they're not together anymore. Not together. The lieutenant echoed. They split again. The scout shook his head. No. Something separated them. A gust of wind cut through their formation and pushed two soldiers backward. Snow swirled in dense walls around them, but beneath the wind, the scout heard something faint, something that didn't belong to nature at all, a cry, muffled by distance and snow. A cry of pain. The scout's expression sharpened. This way, he said, moving toward the source of the sound. The lieutenant grabbed his arm. Hold on, you can't just run into them. We don't know their position. The scout met his eyes with unwavering calm. I do. He pulled free and advanced. Their hands gripped their rifles tightly as they crept behind the scout, expecting an ambush with every step. The storm thickened, then thinned, then thickened again, its rhythm mimicking a pulse. They moved through a narrow corridor of wind where the snow fell in diagonal streaks, revealing a pocket of terrain more sheltered than the rest. And then they saw it, a shape, faint, slumped, almost swallowed by snow, a body. The scout raised his hand, signaling them to hold. He approached slowly, kneeling beside the figure half buried in frost. The soldiers behind him watched with tense anticipation. The scout brushed snow away from the form, revealing a face pale with cold, eyes barely open, lips trembling. It was one of the enemy's soldiers. The man was still alive, just barely. The lieutenant moved closer, disbelief widening his eyes. He's frozen, he whispered. They left him. The scout nodded once. He slowed them down. The wounded man reached out weakly, gripping the scout's arm, as though recognizing in him the first human presence he had felt in hours. His breath was shallow, fragile. He muttered something inaudible, a string of broken words that dissolved into the wind. The scout leaned in, listening carefully. When he pulled back, his expression darkened, something that followed them in the storm. The soldiers stiffened. The lieutenant tried to rationalize it. Snow falling from rocks, ice cracking. The scout shook his head. He said it moved like a person. A shiver passed through the group. If the enemy battalion had been stalked by something unseen in the storm, that meant the blizzard was not only hiding one danger. The scout looked up suddenly, his senses tightening. More are near, he said quietly. The soldiers raised their rifles, scanning the white void, but they saw nothing. Only the scout seemed to perceive whatever moved beyond their sight. He whispered again, "They're afraid." The lieutenant frowned. Them or us? The scout didn't answer. A sharp noise rang out, metal clattering against ice. Then another, and another. Shapes emerged through the storm. Staggering, disoriented. Enemy soldiers, not in formation, not coordinated. They stumbled like men fleeing something in the dark. Their faces were wild with fear. Two of them dropped to their knees, gasping. One turned and shouted into the storm behind him, as if warning someone or something to stay away. The Canadian soldiers crouched low, watching the chaotic scene silently. The scout stood without flinching, studying the broken battalion as though piecing together a story reconstructed from snow, breath, and wind. The lieutenant whispered, "What in God's name happened to them?" But the scout didn't answer. He walked toward the enemy soldiers with steady, deliberate steps. They didn't notice him at first. When they finally did, they raised their rifles instinctively, but their hands were trembling so fiercely that the weapons barely stayed upright. They were exhausted, terrified, frozen beyond reason. The scout raised one hand peacefully, signaling that he wasn't a threat. The men hesitated, confused by the calm presence before them. One of the enemy soldiers collapsed forward, sobbing into the snow. Another tried to speak but only managed to stammer disjointed words in a language fractured by fear. The scout approached and knelt beside them, not as a soldier but as someone willing to listen. After several moments, he turned back to the lieutenant. They didn't know where they were going. They fought each other. Some froze, some fell behind. His expression hardened. But that's not what scared them. The scout looked toward the swirling storm behind the enemy soldiers. They said they were followed. The lieutenant exhaled sharply. By who? The scout shook his head. Not by who. By what? Something they couldn't see. Something that didn't make sound the way people do. Something that stayed just out of reach every time they looked back. The soldiers shifted uneasily. Snow spiraled around them like restless spirits. They said the footsteps were heavy, far too heavy for a man, and they didn't match the storm's rhythm. One of the enemy soldiers, his face pale with frostbite, suddenly grabbed the scout's coat, shouting through cracked lips, pointing frantically behind him. The words were nearly unintelligible, but the emotion was unmistakable. Terror. He repeated the same sentence until his voice failed. The storm thickened there, forming a darker column of swirling snow, as if hiding something within. The soldiers tightened their grips on their rifles, eyes straining. The storm shifted again, the wind stilled for a terrifying heartbeat. Something creaked beneath the ice, something that didn't sound natural. The lieutenant swallowed hard. "Tell me you know what that is," he said softly. But the look on his face told the soldiers one thing with absolute clarity, and the moment that Canadian officers would later describe with disbelief, the moment they would never forget, was approaching through the storm, step by step, unseen but unmistakably real. The storm pressed closer as though the entire sky were collapsing onto the frozen earth, swallowing light, swallowing sound, swallowing reason. The men felt the weight of it, not just the force of the wind, but the sense that something beyond the blizzard was moving, something heavy, something deliberate. The Cree scout stood motionless in the snow, staring into the direction the terrified enemy soldier had pointed. Behind them, the wounded survivors of the opposing battalion trembled in fear, their breaths ragged, their eyes darting to the storm as if expecting it to take shape and strike. The Canadian soldiers shifted nervously, gripping their rifles, feeling the cold sweat beneath their coats freeze against their skin. The lieutenant whispered to the scout, "Tell me what you see," but the scout didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't move. He simply said, "It's still out there." The storm pulsed again, narrowing into a funnel that carved across the snow like a living creature. The men braced themselves as the wind slammed into them with brutal force, but the scout remained anchored as if the land itself held him steady. Then something happens, something the soldiers would struggle to explain for the rest of their lives. The storm shifted tone. It wasn't the wind anymore. It wasn't snow scraping across the ground. It was rhythmic, a pattern, a deep, heavy thud that vibrated through the ice like footsteps, slow and measured, moving with purpose. The lieutenant felt the sound in his bones before he heard it with his ears. "What is that?" he whispered, voice cracking. The scout exhaled a long, tense breath. It's what they ran from. Silence overcame the unit. Not silence from the storm its roar continued, but silence from the men, who suddenly understood why an entire battalion of hardened soldiers had fractured into chaos and fear. The footsteps drew closer, then stopped. The blizzard thickened, then parted for only a fraction of a second, revealing a shadow massive towering indistinct before swallowing it again. One of the injured enemy soldiers screamed, curling into himself, begging for the storm to let him disappear. The lieutenant took a step back, gripping his rifle tighter, though every instinct told him that bullets would be meaningless against whatever moved out there. The scout finally turned to the men and spoke with a calm that contradicted the tremor in the air. "It isn't hunting us," he said. "Not yet." The lieutenant blinked. "Then what is it doing?" The scout lowered his gaze to the ground. "Listening." The soldiers looked at one another, uncertain whether they had heard correctly. "Listening to what?" The scout continued, "It's tracking movement, heat, pressure, sound. It doesn't move like a person because it isn't one." The men swallowed their fear, their breath forming thick clouds. "Then what is it?" one soldier asked. The scout shook his head. The elders talked about things like this. Things that wake in storms. Things that follow the desperate. His voice dropped lower. Things the land keeps hidden until it is angry. The lieutenant tried to steady his breath. "Are you saying this storm brought it?" The scout answered without hesitation. "No, the storm revealed it." Another deep vibration moved through the ice. The soldiers felt the ground quiver beneath them. Snow drifted off the ridge they stood on, carried by the wind in spiraling trails that vanished into the white void. The scout lifted his head again, nostrils flaring slightly, as if catching a scent on the wind. "It's searching," he murmured. "It knows there are wounded. It knows something is dying." The men tensed, realizing the implication. Predators followed weakness, even in human war. But this was something older, something bound to the land rather than the conflict. The enemy soldier on the ground began to scream again as the sound of the footsteps returned, slow, steady, intentional. The lieutenant moved forward, shouting, "We need to move now." But the scout grabbed his arm firmly. "If we run, it will follow the sound." The lieutenant stared at him, horrified. "So what do we do?" The scout closed his eyes for a moment and whispered something in Cree, a prayer or invocation carried away by the wind before anyone could catch its meaning. Then he said, "We wait until it chooses." The officers wanted to argue, but something in the scout's voice made them hold their tongues. The men gathered closer, lowering themselves behind a snow ridge, rifles raised though their hands trembled violently. The storm howled until the world felt like it would collapse under its weight, and then, without warning, everything went silent. Completely silent. The kind of silence that felt impossible, like the land itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. The snowflakes drifted lightly, slowly, falling as if time had slowed. The scout whispered, "It's here." From the white void emerged a shape not fully visible, not fully hidden. It moved with the blizzard, shifting in and out of existence, as if made of the storm itself. Its form towered above human height, but not like an animal. Its mass seemed to ripple, distort, then harden again as it advanced. The enemy soldiers crawled backward, sobbing, begging, their voices cracking under the weight of terror. The Canadian unit trembled as they watched the shadow shift direction, inching toward the wounded soldier half buried in the snow. The lieutenant raised his rifle, but the scout pressed it downward. "If you fire," he said quietly, "you will not have time to regret it." The lieutenant froze, unable to choose between instinct and fear. The shadow paused near the wounded man, looming over him as though studying him. The enemy soldier screamed and covered his face, shaking violently. Snow swirled around the shadow in spiraling vortices, pulled into its movement. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it retreated slowly, deliberately, moving back into the blizzard as if satisfied with whatever it had learned. The storm swallowed it whole. The scout exhaled and stood. "It won't follow us now," he said softly. "It's finished, its search." The lieutenant stared at him, incredulous. What was it? The scout didn't answer immediately. He looked into the storm, his expression both troubled and resigned. "The land keeps many things," he said finally. "Some are spirits, some are storms, some are both." The men stood in stunned silence. Only when the storm began to shift back into a natural rhythm did the scouts signal for the unit to move again. They carried the wounded enemy soldier as best they could, stumbling through the diminishing blizzard until the wind finally eased into a steady whisper. Hours passed before they reached a sheltered ridge where visibility returned enough for them to see the faint outlines of trees in the distance. When they finally regrouped, thawing their frozen eyelashes and wiping frost from their weapons, the officers demanded a full report. The lieutenant described everything: the splitting of the battalion, the panic, the unseen presence in the storm, but it was the scout's part that would stay engraved in military memory. When an officer asked how the scout had tracked a battalion in conditions where even compasses failed, the scout's answer was simple. "Snow remembers," he said. "The land speaks. If you listen, it tells you what passed." But what Canadian officers repeated for decades afterward was not the explanation. It was what one captain said when the report was finished. Shaking his head in disbelief, staring at the Cree scout as though seeing something otherworldly standing before him. "No man should be able to track an army through a storm like that," he said quietly. But he did. He didn't follow their steps, he followed their fear. Years later, the story became a whispered legend in northern outposts. The day a Cree scout tracked an entire battalion through a blizzard so thick it erased the world and sensed something moving behind them that no one else dared to name. Soldiers would repeat the tale around campfires, their voices low, their eyes drifting to the storm outside. And always, they ended the story with the sentence Canadian officers said the day it happened, words spoken with awe, confusion, and a kind of reverence that never faded. He didn't see the enemy. He heard them, and in the storm, hearing was more than a skill. It was survival. It was instinct. It was power. It was the reason that Cree Scout became a legend. The man who could track through a blizzard not by sight, not by sound, but by the fear of those who fled before him.